The story starts with a newlywed couple, Paul and B. B, now a wife, is seen in front of a camera while Paul presents a plate of food. He remembers their first date being an Indian restaurant, which ended with him spending the night on B's bathroom floor due to bad diarrhea. Despite this, he proposed to her. Paul jokes that the Indian food tried to separate them, but they succeeded. The couple appears together on camera, where B reveals they agreed to a cinnamon roll instead of a traditional wedding cake. She expresses her joy at not being alone anymore. The newlyweds Paul and B arrive at a forest cottage. Paul carries B inside, and she begins a tour of her childhood home. She shows a room with a bear hiding, hence the name Bear Room. Paul recalls a bathroom incident where B nearly drowned. B admits the outside is frightening at night, but Paul feels the inside is no different. B reveals her childhood secret of hiding things in hollow, fake ducks. Paul affectionately calls her Honeybee, and she responds with a buzzing sound. During their sleep, a mysterious light slowly passes over the couple. The following day, B playfully wakes Paul with a duck, revealing a note she had written as a child, humorously signed Mallard P. Quack. Later, while making pancakes, B broaches the topic of having a baby, expressing her uncertainty. Paul shares her hesitation, reassuring her that they have plenty of time to discuss their future. Paul seems like a reasonable guy. Paul believes they should focus on their honeymoon. He touches a bear hide in the house and learned B's father hunted it. B questions Paul about his own experiences with hunting, to which he admits he only used traps. They head out to a boathouse to get swimming gear and take a motorboat ride on the lake. B, a former Girl Scout, decides to swim and starts undressing. Paul encourages her to undress, being sure they're alone fully. Encouraged by Paul, B attempts to swim, but finds the water too cold. Their swimming plans are stopped, leading to a playful moment where Paul pretends to throw B into the water. They later shower together at home. On a walk, they spot a restaurant humorously named Restaurant. Inside, they find it empty and encounter a strange man named Will, who informs them it's closed. Disturbed by his anger, they leave before Will recognizes B and calls her Trixie. Surprised, B hugs Will, and they converse briefly in French. Will reveals that his wife's family owns the restaurant and apologizes for his earlier behavior. B tells Paul about Will's past as an excellent hockey player, which Will insists is still the case. Annie, Will's wife, asks them to leave, prompting Will to hold her and explain she's unwell. He offers to bring them food, seemingly more interested in serving B. He is pleased by her smile. At home, B and Paul discuss her thoughts, which Paul suspects involves her ex-lover Will. B clarifies that Will was just a childhood friend. Paul playfully calls her Trixie, mirroring Will. Bill refers to Annie, Will's wife, thinking she is pretty weird. Paul thinks Annie is strange because she is with Will, whom he considers to be weird due to his aggressive behavior. If you think Annie and Will are strange, subscribe to the channel. When B suggests that Annie might be strange, Paul perceives it as her defending Will. He claims they're different from that couple, and B agrees. That night, the lights flicker as they sleep. Paul's alarm rings earlier than usual, making him gather his fishing gear and leave the house, dropping his worm box. Noticing the early hour and the reset clock, he returns inside to find B missing from their bed and the house. The open kitchen door leads him outside, where he anxiously calls for B. Paul, distressed, searches for his missing wife B in the dark woods, which is not the best start for their honeymoon plans. He stumbles upon a naked figure he believes to be B, who screams when he touches her. Back at the cottage, B, now in Paul's shirt, can't explain her disappearance or the location of her nightgown. She apologizes, suggesting she might have been sleepwalking. Paul, at the moment, accepts this story but remains nervous. He watches her sleep, only to wake up the following day to find her gone again. Relieved to find B in the kitchen making breakfast, Paul teases her about her sleepwalking. He notices the burning bread and her forgetting to butter it, leading him to question her well-being. B dismisses it as feeling odd. Paul remembers their many nights together without any sleepwalking incidents or forgotten recipes. He happily helps her with the French toast. B's attempt at making coffee results in hot water, indicating something's wrong. As B speaks, Paul watches her, puzzled, choosing not to express his concerns about her unusual behavior. While on the boat, Paul catches a frog and jokes about it being their dinner, expecting B to laugh, as she used to play with frogs as a child. Instead, they end up splashing each other. B then suddenly jumps into the cold water to swim, surprising Paul. Back home, when questioned, B explains her actions as an attempt to be funny and admits to feeling tired from recent events like their wedding. Paul's primary problem is her happiness. During a kiss, Paul notices unusual marks on B's legs. Despite her saying they're mosquito bites, he suspects otherwise. He wonders if she was bitten while sleepwalking, but B dismisses his concerns and goes for a nap. While she sleeps, Paul re-examines the marks and goes to the spot where he found her the previous night. There, he discovers her torn nightgown, stained with an unknown fluid. Paul discovers large footprints near their home and later overhears B rehearsing a conversation about a headache in front of a mirror, probably for him. This unusual behavior puzzles him. They spend the evening outside by a fire, toasting marshmallows. Paul observes B because he is worried about the whole situation. They return home and share a kiss. During their intimate moment, B complains about a constant headache, which Paul recognizes as her rehearsed excuse. He questions if she's avoiding their private time, which surprises her. He stresses the importance of communication in their marriage, but his attempts to understand her issues are unsuccessful. He expresses that she seems distant. B then claims it's in the laundry when he suggests she wear her nightgown. Later, Paul stays awake and observes B leaving the room, only for her to return quickly, explaining she was getting a drink. Back in bed, Paul questions B about her missing glass, but she remains silent. Later, a mysterious light shines through their window, leaving Paul confused. After failing to spot anything from the window, he goes outside with a shotgun. A noise makes him fire a warning shot, waking B. She warns him about going into the woods, but Paul insists someone is outside and mentions the strange light. Paul confronts B about her sleepwalking and the torn nightgown he found in the woods. He also mentions the large footprints he discovered. B insists she was sleepwalking, but Paul, expressing his love, encourages her to be honest. When he questions if she met Will, B reacts with shock and denial, claiming that Paul is mistaken. B remains silent, accusing Paul of spoiling their time together. Later, both lie awake in bed, Paul playing with a flashlight. B appears upset. In the morning, she oddly writes their names in a notebook, closing it quickly when Paul approaches. Frustrated, Paul starts cooking. Despite the tension, they manage to enjoy their honeymoon in the cottage. Paul, upset, pokes at burnt firewood and flicks ants. He notices B's leg marks worsening and remains skeptical about them being mosquito bites. During a fishing trip, Paul wants to return to the city, surprising B, who reminds him they're on their honeymoon. Despite her efforts to avoid conflict and her desire to stay close to him, their honeymoon seems to be piling up with many problems. Paul discovers blood on his hand, causing him to freak out. Despite B's convincing, he insists the bleeding is abnormal and they need a doctor. B claims it's her period, but Paul, having kept track of her cycle, knows that it's not true. The stress of recent events and the unexpected bleeding push Paul to his limits. He insists they leave and threatens to seek answers elsewhere if B doesn't confess everything to him. Later, Paul tries to enter a closed restaurant and encounters Annie at the dock. Their conversation is suddenly interrupted when Annie collapses. Annie acts oddly, repeating her and Will's names, mirroring B's earlier behavior. When Paul asks for Will, Annie says he's hiding. Paul notices similar marks on both Annie and B. He questions Annie about the marks and if Will is responsible. Annie warns him to stay away, leaving Paul confused. After Annie leaves, Paul finds a blood-stained hat in the water. He enters the restaurant through an open door, despite the presence of a visible camera. Inside the dark, empty place, he finds a computer with Will and Annie's picture and accesses the security camera. Paul watches a video of Annie walking outside at night under a mysterious light before the monitor suddenly turns off. He finds the walls covered in notes, similar to B's strange writings, and one even has the same substance found on B's nightgown. As he leaves, a silhouette is seen behind the window. Back home, Paul finds B's notebook filled with confusing entries, repeatedly questioning her identity. If you're worried for Paul, subscribe to the channel. Paul starts talking to B, hoping to find some answers. After a long delay, B states her name and other basic personal details. Paul questions why she's writing down such simple facts, which are typically present in one's memory. B herself is unsure of her actions. Paul is also curious about the source of a mysterious light outside. He rules out Will as the source after finding his blood-dyed hat and suspects Annie harmed him. He fears B might do the same to him, but she quickly assures him she wants to protect him. This response leaves Paul stunned. In a state of panic, he searches for the car keys but can't find them. Meanwhile, B is in the bathroom, seemingly injecting something into herself. When Paul breaks down the locked door, he finds B surrounded by blood. She quickly stands and insists he returns to the bedroom. Paul, demanding answers, follows her but is met with silence. He is left with the disturbing impression that B is mentally unwell. He addresses her as Honeybee and asks her to respond as she usually does with a buzzing sound. However, she responds with, "We don't remember," referring to herself in the plural. In an attempt to flee, he restrains B and ties her to the bed. He expresses his confusion, stating that his wife doesn't behave this way. He notices a slimy substance on the side of her head. She struggles despite his pleas for her to return to her usual self. Once she calms down, B insists she's his wife. Seeking confirmation, Paul asks her about their first date, but she can't recall. He then asks her about his marriage proposal. She provides some details, but they're not entirely accurate. Paul asks what happened to her. He's on the verge of a breakdown as the love of his life seems to have changed drastically during their honeymoon. Neither of them understand what caused this transformation. This is one of the most distressing experiences he's ever had. Later, he removes a thick, slimy substance from her. At this point, B pleads for Paul's help to remove something from her body. He extracts a strange, over 2-foot-long cord from her. In tears, Paul asks what it is, but B can't answer. Later, in another room, she admits to a disturbing incident in the woods involving light and shadowy figures that entered her body. She claims to feel their presence still and knows their intentions and plans. This revelation leaves Paul even more confused. B wanted to share this with him earlier, but was unable to do so. She had hoped for a peaceful honeymoon. Despite her physical presence, she feels as if it's leaving. Paul, horrified, insists they need to leave immediately and searches for the car keys. However, B tells him he can't go. A light shines on B, making her say, "We don't need him." She again refers to herself as part of a group. She tells Paul his time is up and plans to hide him. To do so, she knocks him unconscious. When Paul awakens, he's tied up on their boat. B tells him she's protecting him by hiding him underwater. After tossing the anchor, she assures him he'll be safe from them in the lake. Despite Paul's pleas that she's making a mistake and he'll drown, B ignores his warnings and throws him into the water. In the final scene, B is seen viewing their post-wedding video late at night. Her transformation into a monstrous figure is evident. As the light shines on her again, she rises and approaches the front door, where she finds Annie, who appears equally deformed. Together, they step outside, where many shadowy entities live, possibly waiting to take away the afflicted pair. Their identities, appearances, and motives remain unknown. We hear the concluding words from B's recording, expressing that she was once solitary, but that is no longer the case. If you enjoyed this recap, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.